Bose strongly believed that plants had a sensitive nervous system and that their responses to external stimuli could be measured and recorded. He had always been fascinated by the plant reactions seen in sensitive plants like the mimosa, which, when irritated, will react with the sudden shedding or shrinking of its leaves. So, curious about the secret world of plants, he invented the crescograph, an early oscillating recorder using clockwork gears and a smoke glass plate to measure the growth and movements of plants in increments as small as 1/100,000 of an inch. Determined to reveal the wonders of plant perception to the world, Bose described his experiments and their results in his 1902 paper, Responses in the Living and Non-Living. He wrote how plants grow more quickly when exposed to nice music and gentle whispers, and poorly when exposed to harsh music and loud speech. He even mentioned how plants became depressed when exposed to polluted air and darkening skies. In short, his work showed that plants could feel pleasure and they could feel pain. Over the decades, several scientists have given further weight to Bose's theory that plants may not be as different from animals as previously thought. Over the decades, several scientists have given further weight to Bose's theory that plants may not be as different from animals as previously thought. How plants sense and react is still somewhat unknown. They don't have nerve cells like humans, but they do have a system for sending electrical signals and even produce neurotransmitters, like dopamine, serotonin and other chemicals the human brain uses to send signals. Michael Pollan, author of such books as The Omnivore's Dilemma and The Botany of Desire, says plants have all the same senses as humans, and then maybe something more. In addition to hearing and tastes, they can sense gravity, the presence of water, or even feel that an obstruction is in the way of its roots, before coming into contact with it. Plant roots will shift direction, he says, to avoid obstacles. Researchers, says Pollan, have played a recording of a caterpillar munching on a leaf to plants, and the plants react. They begin to secrete defensive chemicals, even though the plant isn't really threatened, Pollan says. It is somehow hearing what is to it, a terrifying sound of a caterpillar munching on its leaves.
Introduced.
A person in America who specializes in electronic studies and teaches others how to use lie detectors put both ends of a lie detector to a dragon pot plant and watered its roots. He then found that the lie detector's electronic pen had quickly drawn a curve. This curve was identical to that drawn when the human brain produces a brief second of excitement or happiness. One time he placed two plants together and asked his students to stomp one plant to death in front of the other plant. Then he took the other plant into a room and connected it to a lie detector. He asked 5 of his students to enter the room in turn from the outside. The plant had no reactions when the first 4 students entered the room. When the 5th student who had trampled the plant came into the room, before he even walked up to the plant, the electronic pen quickly drew a curve that only appears when a person is frightened. We can conclude that since plants have life, we should be gentle with them and respect them as living beings. If the compassion in you emerges, you'll be kind to all living beings. There is a very obvious and important objection to the argument that, from an ethical point of view, eating plants is no better or worse than eating animals. This objection concerns the sheer quantity of plants needed to produce meat. Now so many people raised their questions. Plants have feelings, too. How can you kill all of those innocent cabbages and still claim that killing animals is wrong? Haven't you heard about that study where the guy proved that plants have feelings? But just for the sake of argument, let's overlook the complete absence of scientific merit that the claim possesses and assume that it is somehow true that plants are conscious. Let us ignore the fact that plants do not possess brains or nervous systems and assume on the basis of no credible evidence whatsoever that plants are sentient beings and that psychobotany is a legitimate science. Taking this claim at face value actually weakens the carnist's case against the vegan. There is a very obvious and important objection to the argument that, from an ethical point of view, eating plants is no better or worse than eating animals. This objection concerns the sheer quantity of plants needed to produce meat. Producing a single pound of beef, for instance, requires 16 pounds of grain. 1 pound of pork requires 6 pounds of grain, and for every 16 ounces of edible chicken flesh that is produced, at least 5 pounds of innocent plants must lose their lives. In the United States alone, 56 million acres of arable land are dedicated to growing hay for livestock production, whereas only 4 million acres are used to grow fruits and vegetables for people. 30% of the Earth's land surface, which is equivalent to 70% of all agricultural land on the planet, is devoted to growing crops for and raising farm animals. And according to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, the amount of grain fed to livestock in the US alone could feed about 840 million people, roughly 11 times the number of people who die of starvation every year. If one is legitimately concerned with mitigating the amount of suffering in the world, then there is simply no way to justify eating meat, especially if one believes that plants also suffer. We'll leave aside for the moment that these figures represent an egregious, immoral, and unsustainable misappropriation of the world's dwindling natural resources, and we'll concentrate instead on the issue of suffering, which is of such great concern to the many meat-eaters who are convinced that vegans bear the responsibility for inflicting pain and misery upon innocent fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and tubers. If one is legitimately concerned with mitigating the amount of suffering in the world, then there is simply no way to justify eating meat, especially if one believes that plants also suffer. The misery and suffering of the tens of billions of animals raised and slaughtered for food every year are multiplied by hundreds of orders of magnitude if one accepts the claim that plants, as well as animals, possess consciousness and therefore suffer when they are harvested. That killing and eating animals causes them to suffer is undeniable. That eating plants causes them to suffer is a proposition that has never been demonstrated in a controlled scientific experiment, despite the numerous efforts of scientists to determine the legitimacy of so-called primary perception. It's time we recognize the plants have feelings. To argument for what it is, a feckless attempt to undermine the ethical basis of veganism with pseudoscience and bad logic. Your argument is invalid.